Well, good morning, everybody. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with so many old friends and colleagues to celebrate, not so much to celebrate the retirement, that doesn't sound right, does it? But to celebrate the life's work and achievement of our colleague and dear friend, Enzo Michione. Now, most of today's meeting and the forthcoming book on which it's based focuses on the current transitions in capitalism, transitions in the economy, in citizenship, and in welfare, and in the urban sphere. These, of course, have been, as we've already heard, abiding themes in Enzo's work since the 1970s. But in inviting me to contribute to the book, its editors asked me to say something about how this journey began, and specifically about how what was once called the new urban sociology, broadly, political urban emerged. The title of my paper in the book refers to new urban sociology as a child of its times, and some understanding of the times in which it grew up also helps to explain its childlike limitations. So I want to briefly summarize the context to its emergence and some of the limitations, but also say something about the quite distinctive and enduringly relevant, in my view, contribution that Enzo and others in Italy made to these years of critical. I also touch on a key part of the story which has already been mentioned, the emergence of two institutions, RC21 and IJU, work over these decades. But I just want to add one caveat, and I particularly put this in because I was hoping that David Harvey would be here today, and he's not. But what I describe is only part of a wider transformation in the field. At least as important as the new urban sociology was the concurrent rise of the new urban geography. So first then, let me just summarize why the times we lived in then led to a revolution in the previously rather moribund field of urban and regional research. Because time's short today, all I want to do is list what seemed to me to have been some fundamental changes in cities, in social science, and in politics, which acting together laid the foundations for this evolution, what used to be called in the jargon of the times a particular conjuncture. So the first factor was, of course, the rapid and unprecedented state-initiated growth of Western European and United States economies after 1945, and there were parallel processes in the state socialist countries too. This was a so-called period of modernization, which entailed a period of intense urban growth, the mass migration to cities for new urban workforce, and new patterns of urban and regional inequality under the hegemony of what has been called by one analyst coordinated capital. Second factor, by the 1960s, the pressure on governments to respond to the consequences of urbanization, low wages, poor housing, inadequate education and urban services and so on, this pressure had become intense, and programs of subsidized housing, investment in transport, education, education including higher education, and so on, were initiated by governments of the centre-left, and more commonly of the centre-right. Rising conflict in and about the city demanded some political response. Third factor, in consequence, many governments began to look to the social sciences to understand urban conditions and to evaluate urban policies. There was a growth of funding for such research, much of it carried out by young social science graduates, such as myself and many here, who were working outside the universities. Concurrently with the rise of demands and funding for urban research, this is the fourth factor, there were some major changes in the social sciences too. First, there was the enormous expansion of higher education from the 1950s onwards, seen as essential to the development of skills in innovation-based economies. And this entailed, inter alia, a very rapid expansion of the social sciences. The fifth factor, the new social science graduates were also a politically active generation, shaped by an international wave of student activism. We were looking for ways to understand repression and inequality, and none of the conventional social sciences of the time could explain this or wanted to explain it. And the point was not just to understand the world, but to use theory to illuminate and underpin practice too. In the search for suspect at least to have had its own sciences and limitations too, and I'll just mention one or two of these. Under the influence most notably of Castell's early work, and more widely of the new urban research arising first in France and then in the UK and elsewhere, there was a paradigm which linked the supposed domination of large-scale monopoly capitalism, state investment in the reproduction of the labor force through collective consumption, and the growth of oppositional urban movements. But to a considerable extent, all this ignored the real and varied evolution of the organization of capitalist production, its differential impact on cities and regions, and the decline and fragmentation of the relatively solidaristic organized working class which was then occurring. It saw the state as a handmaiden of advanced capital and invested too much faith in the radical possibilities of urban social movements. While it achieved a great deal to overturn old paradigms, many of its own propositions were both narrow and ahistorical. But here in Italy, things were rather different in my view. In my paper, I describe some of the reasons why this is so. But starting perhaps with Franco Ferrarotti's classic study of the Roman shantytowns, published in 1970, and subsequent work of Enzo, Enrico Pugliese, Arnaldo Bagnasco, and other Italian colleagues, a radically different and I think more enduringly useful body of work emerged, laying the foundations, indeed, for a research agenda that includes the three main areas of capitalist transition, which today's meeting will discuss. This work analyzed the historical evolution of Italian urbanization, hyper-urbanization in the industrial cities of the north, a form of non-industrial urbanization in the south, based on building speculation and state employment with poverty, marginality, and underemployment, and the distinctive forms of production, patterns of familiar and precarious work, and so on, in the Third Italy as well. In my paper, I conclude that this distinctively Italian version of new urban sociology, with its emphasis on understanding the range and variety of capitalism, and its emphasis on the fringes of the organized economy, or outside it altogether, prefigured themes that were taken up more widely by critical urban and regional studies in the subsequent decades, and set a more useful basis for understanding the changes brought about by globalization and neoliberalism, changes that were unimaginable in the early 70s. Ironically, though, it was just when the new urban sociology emerged that the conditions, which I summarized earlier, under which it was born, began to disintegrate, as coordinated capitalism and state engagement became seen as a fetter rather than an aid to economic growth and profitability. That critical urban studies continue to develop nonetheless owes a good deal to its success, not just as an intellectual project, if not sadly as a political project, but also as a project to create an international network to support and sustain continued research and debate. In the past 30 years, there's been a more rapid and radical change in some basic aspects of academic work and exchange than at any time in the past. Some of these changes have been for the worse, but innovations such as the web, email, social networking, and online access to libraries have been transformative, enormously facilitating research, its dissemination, and its critical discussion on a global basis. But none of this existed when a small group came together in the late 1960s to argue for a new approach to urban sociology and established RC21 as the heart of an attempt to build a new urban research network. When we started, there were basically only two ways of doing this: by publications and conferences. And these are what the RC and later IJURR were founded to promote. As I show in the paper, there were many limitations to this effort. The Research Council membership stayed at under 100 for many years, and IJURR circulation was also pretty modest, and there were many cultural, linguistic, and other barriers as too. Knowledge of and communication with work in Latin America and in the USA at the start was relatively limited in Europe and vice versa, and that makes Enzo's cosmopolitan contribution, which has been outlined earlier, it was particularly crucial. But even less was known about other parts of the world, and while there was some contact with a few who were studying the inequalities of state socialism, their freedom to work and travel was of course very restricted. In my paper, I analyzed the first decade of IJURR's output, which illustrates some of these limitations, geographically and thematically. However, the International Journal and the Research Committee did provide a forum for the gradual transcendence of some early limitations and a growing focus on emergent features of the urban question in an era of neoliberal and globalizing capitalism. So in its first decade, the International Journal published seminal papers on some of the emergent features of the urban question, for example, on deindustrialization, regional underdevelopment and restructuring, on world cities, on urbanization in Eastern Europe and Latin America, on the informal economy and survival strategies, on employment work and the domestic division of labor, and on early aspects of the globalization of production and the neoliberal project. Today, the network, which began in the 1960s and 1970s, now goes far beyond its limited thematic, geographical, and disciplinary origins. As I illustrate in my paper, this has been aided immeasurably by the changes in the means of academic production, which I've just mentioned. Just to give some illustration of this, when the International Journal started, its readership was largely confined to the few universities that subscribed to the journal and those who had access to their libraries. But in the decade from 2002, in a 10-year period, full-text downloads of articles grew from a handful to 250,000 a year, and it's running far above that by now. And in the 2016 conference of RC21 in Mexico City, there were 21 thematic streams with over 200 papers delivered. So in many ways, the child has grown up and transcended its early limitations, or at least some of them. Having got to that point in my remarks for this morning, I thought this was perhaps a somewhat optimistic or even complacent conclusion. So I just want to pose a few questions which may provoke some discussion. First, it seems clear that critical urban and regional research has become part of mainstream social sciences and to a considerable extent has been institutionalized within higher education. Question, has it lost anything in the process? Second, is it worth paying some attention to the context of how these times we live in are now shaping and determining what research gets done and how it's conceived? Is there still, for example, any attempted link between research and praxis? Thirdly, and this is perhaps a question for our Italian colleagues, how do the still distinctive histories of Italian cities and regions shape their research? Does it have a special contribution to make to critical urban and regional research, as it did, in my view, a generation ago? Finally, and this is probably a more general question for the social sciences, as well as one specific to our field in its context, how do we see the current balance between the forces which facilitate the spaces for academic work and its networks, and those which seek to control and reduce the scope for innovative work? Could another equally lively child emerge in these times too? Thank you very much.